Language is always evolving. Words often change meaning. My friend Bill Allen is a retired city engineer who volunteers once a week as a docent at the Tennessee Aquarium. One day he was stationed by one of the large glass fish tanks when a school group was passing through. One of the students pointed to the tank and said, "Wow, that is a huge fish." And Bill, being well informed in his job, says, "Yes, that's an arapaima." And the student said, "Well, where did it come from?" He said, "It came from the Amazon." And she had a confused look on her face and said, "You mean it came in a box?" Once upon a time, long ago, the Amazon was this famous river in South America. Words change language, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, and it's important that we pay attention to how language evolves. This morning, as you could already detect by what has happened earlier in the service, our attention is being directed toward the priority of following Jesus. Now, to even make that statement seems odd. Shouldn't Jesus be the highest priority for Christians? Well, yes, but that is not always the case. Even the word Christian is being redefined in some narrow doctrinal and political terms today apart from Jesus. And one of the tools for this shift from following Jesus to a very narrow doctrinal or political ideology is the intentional redefinition of the term worldview. One of the tools that's used to shift is to take that term worldview and redefine it in such a way that it means what the person shaping it wants it to mean. Now, the first use of the English term worldview dates back to 1858, according to Merriam-Webster. The simple definition was the way someone thinks about the world. The use of the term worldview in theological circles is traced back to the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, who used a German word that's translated into English as worldview to have a similar meaning. The way someone understands reality or the world based on one's scientific or cultural understandings. Bible scholars picked up on this term from Kant and the concept to note that the biblical writers understood their world, their reality in certain ways according to their own scientific knowledge and their own cultural experience. It's common among Bible scholars to talk, for example, about an ancient worldview versus a modern worldview. But the word worldview had a clear, singular meaning. It was to note that different people in different places, in different times, saw the world, the reality, differently according to their cultural experiences and their scientific knowledge. Now, all of us have lenses through which we see reality. So the term worldview was used to describe one's way of seeing the world, of understanding reality. It was a descriptive term, not a prescriptive term. It was based not on what one believed in terms of faith, but how one perceived reality. In recent decades, however, the term worldview has been captured and redefined to create some narrow definitions of what it means to be a true Christian. Now, those terms, Christian worldview and biblical worldview, are used rather interchangeably and are often narrowly defined by some in order to promote a particular understanding of what it means to be Christian, according to whatever definition that person or group wants to include. For example, one of your local universities offers multiple resources to advance a biblical worldview, to challenge gender equality, environmentalism, equal rights, and other issues. But the one abuse of worldview for a politicized purpose that got my attention and resulted in this sermon and some of my writings and some other initiatives I'm working on came rather recently from the Barna Group. This research group boldly announced that, quote, only 17% of practicing Christians, only 17% of practicing Christians actually have a biblical worldview. And that pronouncement spread across media. And when I received that press release, I was curious. That was quite a claim. Only 17% of practicing Christians have a biblical worldview. So as I dug into the press release and the study, I discovered that something was missing. Jesus. Jesus was missing. Allegiances other than following Jesus had been elevated to defining elements of Christianity and biblical faithfulness. Barna, whose research methods I assume to be proper, got its intended results by starting with a false premise that Christian or biblical faithfulness is about certain narrow doctrinal affirmations largely apart from Jesus. To start with, the Barna Group defines a, quote, practicing Christian as someone who's attended church in the past month, and two, someone who considers their Christian faith to be very important. There's nothing about following Jesus. Although most of us began our spiritual journeys by confessing Jesus as Savior and Lord and promising to follow Him throughout our lives. Then the Barna Group offers 6 criteria that must be affirmed in order to be considered true to a biblical worldview to be counted among the 17%. This list includes such things as affirming belief in absolute moral truth, the Bible's total accuracy, Satan as a real being, God as all-knowing and all-powerful creator, the inability to get to heaven by good works. It's an odd and very selective list, but I'm not interested in quibbling with the list itself. Because what really matters is that this biblical worldview for practicing Christians leaves out Jesus. In fact, the only reference in the whole study is a single criterion that one must affirm that, quote, Jesus lived a sinless life on earth, end of quote. I responded to the person who sent me the press release, said, can you tell me where this came from? And all I got was the list back, not an explanation. But did you hear the gospel reading from Matthew 4 where Jesus called His disciples? Did you catch the part where Jesus said, put down your nets for just a minute, come over here and raise your right hand and swear that I'm sinless and get back to fishing? No, that's not what Jesus said, was it? Listen for the urgency and the demand in Jesus' call to His disciples. Come and follow me. I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and they were in the boat with their father Zebedee. And as they were preparing their nets, Jesus called out to them, and right away they left the boat and their father and followed him. He called his disciples to drop everything they were doing to follow him. And he called them to sacrifice, not some affirmation of a list of narrow beliefs. Further along in Matthew's gospel, in chapter 16, Jesus says what is demanded of his disciples. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The contrast is staggering between what some today call a Christian or biblical worldview, which has little to do with Jesus, and the call of Jesus to his followers. Although it's harder, I'm going to stick with Jesus, and I hope you will too. Beware of those who try to define Christianity in terms of some narrow beliefs or political ideology that aren't focused on Jesus and that Jesus would not recognize. I've created a new filter in my life. When someone says something is Christian or biblical, I start asking the question, where is Jesus? Jesus did not ask his first disciples, and he does not ask us to affirm 6 arbitrary criteria in order to be counted among the faithful. Instead, he said, "Follow me," and he didn't hide the high cost of self-denial. In fact, Jesus spoke clearly of just 2 requirements that he deemed the greatest. They're found in Matthew's gospel as well in chapter 22. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. For all the law and all the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Attending church is good. I'm glad we're here today to worship. This is important. But monthly attendance or even weekly attendance doesn't make us a practicing Christian. And neither does considering our faith very important. A practicing Christian follows Jesus even when it's hard. And it is hard, but it is not complicated. It's hard because living according to the example and the teachings of Jesus goes against our selfish tendencies. It goes against our self-interest and our self-preservation and our self-service. Wouldn't it have been nice if Jesus had told his first disciples and us to simply affirm these 6 statements of belief, rather than to take up our crosses and turn the other cheek and give sacrificially and love our enemies? Jesus could have made life so much simpler for us had he told his disciples, be sure and attend worship once a month and affirm that your faith is very important. Instead, he said, drop everything you're doing and follow me. Growing up in church, I heard a lot about the narrow way to which Jesus calls us. Matthew's gospel addresses that as well in chapter 7. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those are many who enter it. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. However, I was led to believe that the gate is narrow because so few people believe the correct narrow-minded ways we do, so not many are getting in. But that's not exactly what Jesus is saying here. The gate is narrow and the way is hard because following Jesus requires us to do more than just affirm certain beliefs and show up every now and then. It requires us to love God and others to a degree that makes us vulnerable and uncomfortable. So I want to say it again to be sure we get it, that following Jesus is hard, but it is not complicated. But as Jesus said, it leads to life. So may we beware, just because someone labels their preferred doctrines or political ideologies as biblical or Christian doesn't make them so. We should reject anyone's so-called essentials of faith if they downplay or replace following Jesus. And may we especially take note if those biblical or Christian claims include justification for discriminating against other children of God. And may we remember that there is no political ideology, no doctrinal requirement, and no other priority that is a substitute or even a close second to the call to follow Jesus by loving God with all of our being and our neighbors as ourselves. In the ministry I lead called Nurturing Faith, we're exploring some new ways to advance the Jesus worldview, to provide resources and experiences to help churches create a stronger congregational culture that's more squarely focused on following Jesus rather than those things that tend to divide us. And I'm not sure where we're going with this, but I am sure of this, that the Christian witness in America today needs a clearer focus on what Jesus actually said and did, and how Jesus actually called his followers to a life of service and sacrifice. Two final words. When someone talks about a biblical worldview, remember that the Bible in all of its glory is really about two subjects: how we relate to God and how we relate to one another. And when someone talks about a Christian worldview, remember that being a faithful Christian is hard, but it is not complicated. That Jesus showed us and told us how it is to be done. We must simply do that, even when it gets hard. And one more thing. Those simple words Jesus said to his disciples, he is continually saying to us as well. Drop what you're doing and follow me. May we continually examine our lives, hear that call, and respond with faithfulness.